Airing on Asheville FM in Asheville, this is The Final Straw Radio, a weekly anarchist and anti-authoritarian broadcasts and podcast emanating out of occupied Chalagi land in southern Appalachia. We bring you voices and perspectives from projects and struggles all around the world, and you can find our archives, transcripts, ways to follow us and support us at thefinalstrawradio.noblogs.org. This week, a new contributor, Ian, talks to cartoonist and educator Johnny Damm about his recent releases, I'm a Cop, featuring dialogue from police union speeches, as well as Riot Comics' Tompkins Square Park, which explores the 1988 Tompkins Square riot, in which the police evicted an unhoused encampment in the park on New York's Lower East Side. They discuss the collage techniques by which Damm assembles his comics, how his work dovetails with the larger work of abolition, and the role of propaganda in movement making. Listeners can follow Johnny Damm on Twitter at DammJohnny with 2 M's, or on Instagram at johnny.damm. His website is johnnydamm.com. The Final Straw is a proud member of the Channel Zero network of anarchist podcasts, and here's a jingle from another member, Susie N.
I know the kind of pain you're feeling, Alex. I once had it myself.
You some kind of doctor?
No, Alex. I am Magneto, and I have come to offer you sanctuary.
Hello, this is our jingle for our podcast, The Grounded Futures Show.
This is the show where we discuss topics ranging from climate change to identity to how youth can gain new skills to thrive amid current and ongoing disasters that we are collectively facing. We are your hosts, one Gen Z Liam and one Gen X Carla. And we think we all deserve to thrive now and not in some distant utopian future.
Yeah, but that's in the future. Oh, I hate the future.
Yeah, we're with Bolin. Grounded Futures is a larger project, so check that out over at groundedfutures.com.
So, can you say a little bit about yourself, including your preferred pronouns and any organizations or affiliations you want to mention?
Sure. I'm Johnny Damm, he, him, and I'm an artist and a cartoonist. I previously published with a publisher called The Operating System, who has recently sort of ceased publishing. So I'm currently mainly unaffiliated. Okay.
So we are here today to discuss your comics work. Can you tell me a little bit about the process by which you assemble your comics? And I'm speaking in particular about your recent releases, I'm a Cop, and I believe the other title is Riot in Tompkins Square Park.
Riot Comics, yeah.
Riot Comics.
Sure. I mean, so my comics are all research-based. And I guess you could say that along with being made, they're kind of assembled. So I start my comics, looking for the materials that I'm interested in working with. So part of that's sort of research in the voices that I want in the comics, because with both I'm a Cop and Riot Comics, they're entirely made of text from other people, from other voices. So I'd say the first part of me making comics is finding those voices. I mean, I guess before that you could say the subject. So with I'm a Cop, I spent a couple years paying attention to sort of all the public statements I could find of U.S. police union leaders. And once I'd sort of amassed enough statements, I then began to think about how to sort of make them into comics. And I came up with the idea in that case of making them into horror comics. And I combined the text, the statements, with images from early 50s, sort of pre-code crime comics and some photographs. I put these together through Collage. And I think that's how I end up kind of assembling the final work. With Riot Comics, I was using the voices of participants in the Tompkins Square riot from the Lower East Side, New York, 1988. And in that case, I was combining it with imagery from Depression-era photography and pre-code crime comics.
Okay, and just for any of the non-comic book readers out here, can you just clarify what pre-code means?
Oh yeah, pre-code means, so before 1954. In 1954, comics mass censored themselves. And in doing so, they really messed up the medium and the industry. A good deal of the comics industry went out of business, and they had to stop publishing the majority of crime comics, pretty much all horror comics. And after that point, a medium which had been really sort of widely read, sort of by adults, children, surprisingly diverse in terms of creators. After the code, comics were sort of forced to be appropriate for children for a time, and the diversity of the creators and the diversity of the readership really, really shrunk. So that's the distinction, and why I have a particular interest in pre-code comics.
Okay, so for those who don't know, in the avenue of, or the venue of, kind of small press publishing, the typical ways to do it are either just straight self-publication or by crowdfunding them. Now, if I'm correct, I believe that you self-published this. Is that right?
Yes, both of these comics were self-published, and I don't actually crowdfund, just because I don't really like having to try to sell myself in that way. So yeah, I mean, I'd published, like I was saying earlier, I'd published with a publisher for some years. And I think a lot of the really exciting work that's coming out of comics often is in self-published and mini comics. So with I'm a Cop, I didn't want to wait for a publisher, among other things. And I also really was sort of done with it. Like, I didn't want to spend any more time studying police unions. So yeah, I put that out myself. And that was my first self-published comic. And now I'm sort of committed to putting out a couple comics a year. That means I don't have distribution, which is a little tricky, but I have managed to, still get it into a handful of stores sort of worldwide. And, the I'm a Cop, I would say, has traveled around quite a bit.
Well, I mean, I believe you've sold upwards of 2,000 copies, right? That's a pretty huge number for this kind of a release. Am I right about that?
Oh yeah. No, I've sold just over 2,000 at this point. And yeah, that was, I'm not gonna lie, that was a total surprise. I mean, if you still pick up I'm a Cop, it actually says on the inside jacket that there was only 250 copies, because that was my original run. Because honestly, I mean, in the small press publishing world, it's the same thing with comics and books. I mean, typically, people are only selling a couple hundred copies of things. So in this case, I mean, I had posted about it on Twitter. I'd done a thread on Twitter about it that really gained a lot of interest. And yeah, so I immediately had to rush through to a new printing of it. And yeah, it's sold quite a bit. I got contacted by stores. I think in the case of I'm a Cop, I mean, I think the subject matter, I mean, maybe the concept a little bit of the book, but I mean, I think it also is really just about people are interested in unconventional approaches, I think, to sort of issues of policing in the U.S. and, criticisms of policing in the U.S. So I think that book definitely, at least for my standards, really sort of caught fire unexpectedly.
Well, I mean, it's not presented in a way that people are used to consuming this kind of information. It's sort of, I don't know if abstract is the right word, but given that approach, it's sort of I don't want to say it's a difficult approach, but it's an unconventional approach. What do you think has allowed it to resonate so much with people? Do you think it's strictly the subject matter, or do you think that your work frames it in a unique way?
I mean, that's an interesting question. I mean, I'd say that part of it, one of the reasons it reads fairly abstract, I think, even as a comic, is that, I have a visual poetry background to an extent that, I certainly have a comics background, and I'm thinking about it as comics, but I'm not trying to be literal in terms of my approach, in terms of how I present the material. And I think maybe when you're talking about such sort of, in some ways, hard to digest material as this, because in I'm a Cop, I mean, the cops really say terrible things. And it's, it's ugly. And I mean, certainly people were interested in that. I actually when I originally started talking about it online, people were interested in this as a way to sort of like present research, like alternative ways to present research. And I think that was part of what made people interested in it sort of conceptually. But I think the other part of it is sort of its existence as a comic, that there's something about, I mean, I'd say the great power of comics is that we're trained to read them, right? I mean, like we're all just so used to it from childhood on to read comics that we find comics easy, right? We have this sort of, I mean, perhaps mistaken idea that a comic is easy. So it feels easy, and that allows comics makers to put in really hard subjects in some ways. I mean, and formally too. I mean, people do really complicated things on the page, and the readers just kind of straightforward accept it. So presenting challenging material, political material, comics is a really natural form for that, because there's like an openness, I think, that comics readers bring to the page that other mediums don't necessarily have, at least to that extent.
Sure. So as a lifetime comic book reader, even now when I think the reputation of comics are kind of the highest they've been, I still feel like it is a pretty marginalized medium. So when I think of comics that I find to be uniquely made or uniquely provoking, I like to imagine how they will be perceived by someone given no context, like someone who, stumbles on it years later in like a dollar bin. In what context do you think your work is at its most impactful?
Context. Now that's a really interesting idea. I mean, an interesting question, because, I'm a Cop in particular has moved through various contexts. Like I had there was an academic who contacted me, actually two academics that contacted me who bought copies to teach in their classrooms. And that was a surprise, because I'd certainly never thought about the context of someone picking it up in a classroom and thinking about it in that way. But it's an interesting, it's flattering, and it's an interesting kind of challenge to think what is appropriate for a classroom. I would say sort of contextually, I mean, I would hope that it would be legible for anybody, sort of in any context, right? Like, I mean, I love dollar bins. I love long boxes of dollar comics or quarter comics or 50-cent comics. I mean, tend to be dollar comics now. But and just randomly stumbling upon really interesting works. I would hope that my work, that would be an ideal sort of venue for my work in many years. But I'm not entirely sure.
Okay. So your comics are hard to describe, but a oversimplified version would be you have a figure from comics juxtaposed against the form of a field, rather, of a photographic background. I feel like the figures you selected for both I'm a Cop and Riot Comics are sort of static within the photographs that you selected. And they also seem to be more focused on details of larger pictures than some of your previous work. If I'm right about that, would you say that is a metaphor for kind of the stagnant persistence of the issue, that it's kind of like a gridlock?
I mean, I like that idea. I certainly think with I'm a Cop, I meant I'm a Cop to read very sort of statically. And I'd say that sort of formally, I was thinking of the comics panels as a grid in some ways, sort of like a grid. I mean, I literally sort of use comics as an overlay. I do this kind of strange thing, which is that I take old comics and scan them and cut out what's inside the panels. And sometimes I remake the panels a little bit, but and then I overlay a photograph with the panels. I mean, with the page with the panels cut out, and then I begin to put in other elements, other collage elements to make the page. Certainly, when I was dealing with the cops, I mean, something about the voice of the police. I'd say each page certainly as sort of like a static moment, right? Like I'm not thinking about it in terms of narrative or really even sequence. So, I mean, even though there is a movement of it, and in some cases there will be figures that you could say are sequential in one way or another. So I didn't think of that in terms of a metaphor for how the issue is sort of immovable at this point. But I quite like that. And that works for me, and it certainly might have been somewhere in the process, somewhere along the way in the process. Riot Comics, I think I was doing something a little bit different, because in that case, the backgrounds, I'm not always using a single photograph for the background. I do sometimes, but that one has a little bit more variety, because in that comic, there's moments where I wanted it to sort of capture the feel of an actual sort of scene, like a little bit of sort of sense of narrative, and particularly of the sense of the rioting and the moments, if that answers your question.
Absolutely. So you've spoken a little bit about the source material for the comic portion of the collage. I wonder if you could say a little bit about the photos that you used to create your work, because there is, if I understand correctly, a consistency to where you are pulling these from.
Yeah, I mean, I actually have been pulling my photos from the same place in all my comics, actually, since almost a decade. And the photographs I use are old Depression era WPA or specifically Farm Security Administration photographs from the Great Depression. I started using those, I mean, partially because I liked the idea of using them. Like it's like they're literally ours. It's like they were the government commissioned them. They were arguably designed to be about sort of the state of the US. Like that's what they were documenting. And so I originally used them, and in I'm a Cop, I really just use tiny little details, often blown up. So there's no like figures in the majority of I'm a Cop's photo backgrounds. With Riot Comics, I decided for the first time in my work, I would use the same sort of series of photos. In that case, I specifically used the work of a photographer that I quite love named Dorothea Lange. And I used quite a bit of the actual figures of people that she photographed, because the majority of the people that she photographed during the Depression were unhoused. They were itinerant workers, itinerant farmers, sometimes like flood refugees. And I thought that had some interesting sort of echoes and some interesting resonance when sort of putting those figures in discussion with the comics elements, and in discussion with the sort of historical events and sort of the various moments of crises that we're in now. Riot Comics in particular deals with part of what set off the Tompkins Square protests, which turned into a riot, was the eviction of the unhoused community from that park. So I thought there was something kind of fitting about pulling out these sort of historical images of the unhoused in various areas of the U.S.
You mentioned that, I believe, you've been working with this process for a decade. How did you first see the possibilities in this process, and how have you, refined it over the course of your career working with it?
Yeah, I mean, I come from outside of comics in some ways. I mean, I don't, I actually would say that in all my work, I've always been sort of like a minor figure in a variety of communities, is how I've put it before. So, I'm a minor cartoonist, I'm sort of a minor poet, and I'm a minor artist. So I've always approached things, not really exactly from the inside. And that was certainly how I came to comics. Like I've always been someone, you said it, that was a lifelong reader of comics, like you said about yourself. And, a comics obsessive in a lot of ways. But I, actually studied just writing, right? I studied art history and I studied writing. And I thought I was going to write novels, honestly. But I just wasn't ever sort of satisfied with the prose. And I ended up finding myself, I wrote a whole novel that was about a comic book artist. And it's just in a drawer now. But one of the things that I did in the novel is I spent all this time describing what takes place in the comics. And I became obsessed with this idea of trying to sort of capture the feel of the comics page, like the actual sort of composition, the actual sort of panels, but doing it in prose. And at some point I was just like, holy crap, right? I mean, like, why am I not just making comics? And that sort of began the process for me of, thinking about what I wanted in making comics. And I am really interested in collage, and I'm really interested in the iconography, I think, of pre-code comics in particular. So I initially began playing with pages from Old Classics Illustrated, which are adaptations of like canonical Euro literature. I began just sort of cutting them up and staging photographs and then making those into comic book pages. And that was sort of the first step. I didn't end up liking how they turned out, even though actually quite a few of those works ended up in my first book. But at some point while I was working on that project, I began to realize that I wanted to approach every page as a physical object. So literally every page I make is I still have. They're sort of physical collages, which the last step is I scan them in, and that's what makes it into the page. What's been refined over the years, I mean, I guess it's just that I keep kind of experimenting within this relatively small box that I've created for myself, which is, that I'm using the same sets of old photographs. I'm using pre-code comics. And I just keep putting them together in different ways. And I will say, I mean, I think like all artists, I think I'm better at it than I used to be. And I'm certainly more ambitious with the pages. But the big surprise for me in a lot of ways was just sort of being willing to step into the sort of the comics community and being sort of accepted by the comics community. When I come from comics, it's from such a distinct and kind of unusual place. One of the things, the developments of the last couple of years, which has been really meaningful for me, is sort of reaching out and becoming, I'd say still a minor member of the cartoonist community, but that's been meaningful for me in both in terms of the refinement of the work itself, but also in sort of the being able to join the larger community.
Okay. Yeah, that's great. So in practicing collage within the medium of comics, you are essentially imposing a grid onto a visual work. How do you think that those limitations of the grid affect your approach? I'm sure they're hindering sometimes and they're helping sometimes, but I would like to maybe know a little bit more about that.
Yeah, so I think of the grid, and part of this comes from, so when I was in graduate school, and this is a very indirect way of something that got me into comics, is that I did my largest studies when I was getting my doctorate in the history of the avant-garde, and particularly avant-garde poetics. And I became really interested in what's often called restraint-based work, or constraint-based work. So the idea that it's, that there's a power in setting limits for yourself. So, kind of extreme examples of that is, an avant-garde writer wrote a novel where he refused to use the E, right? And by limiting yourself and sort of taking away some sort of paths, in some ways it's freeing. And you end up having to make decisions that you want to make otherwise. And I've found that's been enormously productive for my work. So the idea of using the grid is I'm always restricted. I tend to think about things on the level of a single page, opposed to thinking about this as sort of larger sort of canvases or larger pieces. I really try to think it out on a page by page basis. That panel grid, it restricts my choices. And by restricting the choices, a lot of times it means that I go to places that I didn't plan for that get much, much more interesting. I also think that one of the things that the panel layout does, particularly when you're using someone else's panel layouts, as I do, because I'm using these old panel layouts, is that sets the rhythm of your page. And there's something really interesting about trying to match what you're putting in those panels rhythmically for how the grid already works. So that's like, in some ways, I don't know if any of that comes across to the reader of the comics, but as a creator, like, in some ways, that's my absolute favorite part.
Okay, so I'm taking a little bit of a leap here.
Okay.
But that's a very compelling explanation, and I wonder if that might apply also to could be applied to organizing in general, organizing in the activist sense. I wonder if you have any thoughts on that.
Huh. I think that's a great idea. I mean, I haven't thought about it. I mean, I've thought a lot about sort of the activist potential of comics, and in the way in which comics have, very infrequently been used, some ways, as sort of like an educational tool that fits into organizing. And of course, I'd say that much more than comics in organizing has been the longtime presence of zines, sometimes which have comics elements. Now, in terms of the constraint and organization, that's a great idea. I haven't thought about it enough to say anything coherent about it, in all honesty. But that's a leap in sort of logic that I really like. And if you have any ideas about it, I'd like to hear it.
Well, it just occurred to me, so I don't have any ideas about it.
Fair enough. I mean, I think I will say, just in terms of the sort of political, I'll just say that I have lots of thoughts about the political, what I would say is how comics have been used typically in the United States, which has been, for promoting kind of imperial purposes, propaganda, and, just being very sort of politically conservative overall, opposed to the possibilities for comics to actually sort of fulfill a role in sort of much more sort of politically radical activist circles. I think that's actually been, in US comics, has been really underexplored. But yeah.
If you would like to support The Final Straw, you can subscribe to our podcast via various platforms, follow and share our materials online, as well as give us feedback via the links at tfsr.wtf/tree, as in Linktree. To support our transcription work and wider project, you can subscribe to us via patreon.com/tfsr. You can also buy some merch or find donation methods at tfsr.wtf/support.
Okay. So that kind of leads me pretty nicely into my next question. Do you think depictions of police are necessary in pop culture? I may be understanding, but I feel like there's a portion of the discourse that dismisses all or most depictions of police as propaganda. And, especially when it comes to genre entertainment, I feel like if genre is meant to evoke the situations of real life, it seems sort of impossible to, subtract that very ever-present portion of real life.
Yeah. I mean, I think about this myself because, I'm deeply, deeply critical of the history of crime comics, while I also am a longtime reader of crime comics. And certainly, in film, I love old crime, a lot of old crime films, and I don't automatically turn away from something if it features police officers in a way that doesn't sort of match my politics. So I'm willing to give a little bit of sort of credence to the idea of pulp literature sort of working as fantasy, policing as sort of tropes of that fantasy, etc. But the other side of that is the way in which U.S. media has been weaponized by police and, the sort of U.S. government, and the way in which it's been used, these portrayals overall have been used in a way that sends out, as propaganda, as copaganda, but also propaganda. In World War II, literally the U.S. government was working with comics artists to create propaganda against sort of the Japanese and the Germans. In the 50s and the 60s, the U.S. government was literally making comics, which anti-communist comics, which they were, they were smuggling into places like Cuba to try to use comics to help overthrow the government. In terms of policing in comics, I'd say that policing has been part of the overall sort of good, bad binary of mainstream comics that has done a lot of damage. So, I'm not saying that there can't be police in comics, but I do think that comics has to sort of step back. Comics creators in particular need to step back and ask themselves what they're contributing to this, really problematic, toxic culture. We get more and more policed every year, and absolutely crucial to policing. And there's more police murders every year, as we've just seen in 2022. Absolutely crucial to this is that the cops are telling us over and over again that we're unsafe and that we need to be afraid. Is our media, is our pop culture, is our pulp literature contributing to that? Yeah, right? I think that's okay. But if that's the only thing they're contributing, then maybe they really are being used as tools of propaganda. And I think much of the history of U.S. comics has, whether purposely or inadvertently, been weaponized to justify police states, to justify the military, et cetera, et cetera. So I think at the very least, we gotta look really hard at that.
On the flip side of that, what role do you think that propaganda plays in, movement making, movement building on the left?
Sure. Sue Coe, who's a printmaker who sometimes is published in the comics world. So she published in World War III Illustrated, which is a really important sort of politically radical comic that's still being published. She's always said she makes propaganda, right? I think for me, it's propaganda. Or is it? Propaganda maybe isn't the way I think, certainly of my own work. I think it's important. I think we all have to get out our messages, and we got to utilize all sort of the tools we have to get out our messages. My personal message is, hey, here's this thing that I think y'all should be paying more attention to, right? Like, you need to be paying attention to what the police are telling us about about who they are, sort of fundamentally. And if you pay attention to what they're fundamentally saying, then that probably will point you to considering defunding the police, considering abolishment of the police. I personally don't think about that as propaganda, but I do understand that it is part of the history of sort of like message making. And message making is part of it. I mean, if we are constantly being propagandized, right? If the number one film in the country was that whatever that Top Gun movie was, right? That's telling. So yeah, there needs to be a response to that, right? That's the sort of the cultural playing field we're at. So I guess the short answer would be, I don't think of my work explicitly as propaganda, my personal work. But I certainly do accept the idea that the left needs to use media, needs to use visuals in terms of education and propaganda.
Okay, thank you. So I feel like the seeds of both I'm a Cop and Riot Comics are most apparent in Failure Biographies. I'm not sure if that's your first or second work.
That's my second book, yeah.
Okay, so in addition to process similarities, I see a sort of a potent metaphor in the notion of building on failure as intrinsic to the slow work of abolition. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Sure. I mean, one of the things, when Failure Biographies came out, the only thing in its reception that I was a little uncomfortable with is that a lot of people were like, yeah, it's, failure. It's like, failure, that really stinks. It's kind of like, you're telling these sad stories of people who were failures. Where actually the book is much more like what you were describing, which is that, it's in some ways a celebration of failure and the necessary work of failure. I mean, activism is based in failure. The idea of sort of being able to sort of say what you want and to imagine a radically different world on your daily basis, you're not going to achieve that radically different world, right? So a lot of the things, the vast majority of everything you try, you're not going to get all the way there. You're going to fail at it. So, there's something I think really important about mapping. Jack Halberstam calls this the sort of anti-capitalist space of failure. That you're not thinking about this in terms of sort of binary terms of, like success and sort of profit. Instead, it's about the slow work. It's certainly abolition is a perfect example of that. As someone who considers himself an abolitionist, you have to be able to picture a world without police and a world without prisons. But you also have to, if by the time I die, there's still police and there's still prisons, that doesn't mean that it's all over, right? Like that is sort of the slow work of every sort of step of the way is this sort of combination. And if we don't think so binarily about sort of success and failure, we don't think in these sort of capitalistic terms, it's much better for everybody. And I think that's what part of the reason why Jack Halberstam really says that we do need to sort of celebrate failure in that way. So that was part of the idea, I think, of looking at it in Failure Biographies. And I would say that in that book in particular, which is histories of various artists who have occupied spaces of failure. Because I would say several of the artists in there, are actually quite famous. So, it's not like they're career failures. But there's something in their works that have had sort of a failure component. I'd say the most crucial of those failure biographies for me that sort of, I think, led to my next works, particularly with I'm a Cop and Riot Comics, is the story of this Argentinian art collective called Tucumán Arte. And Tucumán Arte really was trying something with their art, which, is by design impossible. right? Like, I mean, they sort of said that, they were in Argentina under a military dictatorship, right? Like massive oppression. And they're like, we want to use our art to show people the world. And by showing people the world, change the world. And they said that's the only thing that's okay if it changes. So they did a giant installation that sort of was about this area of Argentina called Tucumán, and showing all sort of the oppression and all the terrible things that was going on there that was the exact opposite of what the government said about the region. And so they did an entire installation sort of with what they would say is the truth of how things actually were. And in doing that, they were attempting to change the world. They failed, of course. And their particular failure was pretty bleak because, a good number of them ended up being disappeared. Some of them became guerrilla soldiers. A good percentage of that collective of artists quit art. But to me, it's such an amazing idea of how art can be used, right? To show people the world. And while you're not going to literally change anything with that, like the odds of there being a major change with that, it's a nudge, right? It's a bit of a change. And that's the work of art. And that philosophy, the Tucumán Arte philosophy, is what I was attempting to do, certainly with I'm a Cop and Riot Comics.
Cool. Thank you.
Sorry for how long that is.
No, that's perfect. So we sort of touched on this a little bit earlier. I don't know how this figures into, I don't know if this figures into your use of materials given the digital tools available, but first part is how important is physical media to your process? There are plenty of supplies of old comics if you know where to look, but I wonder if you think physical media in general is correctly valued by people in comparison to the convenience of digital access.
I mean, in terms of is it sort of like valued enough? Is it fairly valued? That's a hard question. I will say that, I've found it enormously useful in my work to sort of exist between sort of both spaces, right? Like, my work is inherently physical, in that I am working off of old comics that I have, even though I don't have the old photographs. Those I find entirely online through the New York Public Library, actually. But the trick with the old comics for me, part of what I really value in the old comics is their physicality. So I scan them and I make them into something digital, and then I immediately print them back out. And over the time, and then I scan them again. And I have a really crappy printer. I have a really low cost scanner. And I'm working with really degraded copies of these old comics because, among other things, I don't have the money to buy old comics in good shape. But in doing so, I think that my work actually ends up exaggerating, sort of in some ways, the physical notion, the physical part of the comics themselves. So, the color of the page, the aged page, is part of my work. And my work is definitely meant to then be remade into a physical object. But I think there's really something useful in that tension, right? Between sort of the physicality of it and sort of the digital world. In terms of how I want people to read my comics, I would say that I would prefer if they read them physically, but if they read them digitally, that's fine too. I often, when people are overseas, if they can't find a copy because shipping's so expensive, I give them a link to where I've posted my comics online and be like, feel free to read them this way. But there is a different relation to the physical comic that I think it's worth at least trying not to abandon. And I think that is at least part of the subject of my work and the sort of weird way I make comics.
Your work seems to be drawing from a number of long traditions in comics, criticism, and politics. I was wondering if you could place your work into the context of your own experience and maybe talk about what your history is with all of these various media, who are your influences, And do you see the medium of comics as a means to an end, or are you genuinely a fan, which I think that you already kind of spoke to?
Yeah, I mean, I'm generally a fan. I mean, genuinely a fan. I mean, yeah, I mean, I'm a lifetime comics reader. I mean, I would say that, when I was probably like anybody, when I was a little kid, I was reading superhero comics. And then by the time, I was I think by the time I was like 10 or 11, I decided I was super punk rock. And sort of joined kind of punk rock communities sort of centered around music and going to see live music. And then superhero comics didn't seem okay to me anymore. And so at that point, I mean, I'd say I got into 90s Vertigo comics were probably the sort of next step, stuff like Sandman and Hellblazer, Alan Moore, sort of stuff like that. And then I found underground comics, and then I found the alternative scene. And I'd probably say that for me, the most sort of formative, I mean, my all-time favorite comics are Love and Rockets, like by the Hernandez brothers, particularly Jaime Hernandez's work in Love and Rockets, including to now, which I think is still totally fabulous. When thinking about this in terms of sort of the political content, I've been sort of looking back at all of these works now and sort of thinking about how they sort of approach things sort of in terms of political worldviews. And it's interesting, right? I mean, certainly, I mean, I loved Frank Miller for a time when I was probably like 11 or something. And Frank Miller's worldview is really disturbing. But I will unabashedly, and then, underground comics were really misogynistic. So that was a little bit of a problem too. My direct influences are a little tricky. I mean, because there isn't been a whole lot of people who did comics collage. There was an artist who is named Jess, who did some really amazing comics collage work that, in particular, he remade Dick Tracy comics into a comic called Tricky Dick, which I just love. There's a collection of his work that was put out by Siglio some years ago. And then there's not a ton, right? I mean, you can find collage in, Jack Kirby has some, and actually, I will say, when you're talking about the lineage of the photographic background and using comics elements over photographs, you have to talk about Jack Kirby, because that was something he did really well. And I think was quite unappreciated, I think, within Marvel in the 60s and 70s. Will Eisner even did a little bit of comics collage. So, I mean, certainly all that stuff is in my lineage. But yeah, I mean, it's so definitely not a means to an end. Like comics is what I want to do my entire life. Even though I will say that in some ways, even though I feel like I am part of the comics community, I'm always feel like I'm still sort of working to sort of place myself in exactly where I am in the comics community, if that makes sense.
Yeah, that does make a lot of sense. I feel like of the sort of the mass mediums, if that makes sense, comics, I think, have the most messy and sort of diluted delivery, if that makes sense. Like they always just seem messy. There's not ever a straight line to any kind of politics necessarily. I mean, there are expressly political works, but in the way that they are released kind of out into the wild, it's, there's not a clear way that they are perceived, if that makes sense.
Yeah, I mean, well, I don't think there's a clear sort of lineage of political works. I mean, I think that for the most part, they've been, they pop up at various sort of points, but that even someone like Spain Rodriguez, who was an underground artist, I mean, he was making explicitly political works in the late 60s and early 70s, but I mean, they were undercut by the fact that his works were also, incredibly misogynistic, and sort of the worldview was not radical even though he was sort of placing his work in sort of a radical content. But even in the underground scene, he was just an outlier. Like, he was part of sort of that boys club, but there wasn't anybody else who was really working like that. And I think that throughout comics history, the political stuff sort of comes and goes. And that certainly has something to do with what you mentioned kind of early on about that even in our moment where comics are so mainstream, the history of comics as a disreputable medium is still very much part of it. Is still very much part of the medium itself, right? That how it was received as junk for so long, has worked against it, and it certainly worked against it having a coherent political vision. I think a lot of the ways that people have talked about comics, I mean, particularly older comics, as sort of like old war comics being jingoistic, as old romance comics being sort of heteronormative and sexist, that's an oversimplification too, right? Because on the other side of that, there was plenty of old romance comics that were transgressive and had really interesting sort of messages. There was plenty of war comics that were actually anti-war comics. But again, there's not a clear lineage of how that works sort of politically, or a clear line, unlike that there is in many other mediums.
As a quick aside, have you seen the Spain Rodriguez documentary that was just released?
I haven't. Have you?
Yeah, it's finally out on some streaming services. You should check it out if you get a chance. It was very good.
I will check it out. I've always been, like I said, I've always had really mixed feelings about Spain Rodriguez, and pretty much the whole first generation of underground guys.
Yeah, same.
But that being said, I'm very interested in him. So yeah, I'll definitely check that out.
So we're kind of winding down here. In some recent comments on social media, you characterized U.S. comics as a conservative medium and an individual medium.
Yeah.
And that sort of resonated with me, but I wonder if you could maybe kind of extrapolate on that.
Yeah, I think on one side of it, there's the history of how U.S. comics have been used sort of politically. That is, like I said earlier, does have a history of there's a great book by a guy named Paul S. Hirsch called Pulp Empire: The Secret History of Comic Book Imperialism, I think it is, that talks about how U.S. comics have been used for imperial purposes, right? Sort of historically. And I've talked quite a bit about how the history of how crime has been depicted in U.S. comics have served, a distinctly propaganda function. But the other side of that, in terms of a medium, is that sort of, and I would say starting with underground comics, particularly where we're at in terms of mini comics and indie comics, there is a total focus on the individual. I mean, I would say that the default of indie comics for many, many years has been memoir. And I think there's a lot of really powerful memoirs. I think memoirs can certainly have a political function in kind of like highlighting sort of underrepresented communities. And there's certainly a place for memoir. But where are the U.S. comics that think about us collectively, that think about us sort of not in terms of the individual, but as the whole? And that is what an actually politically radical comic could be. So the focus on the individual, I do think in U.S. comics, and this is in the part of U.S. comics that I think people sort of think about as left, I think means that it still very much ends up being quite conservative. And I really do, I try to push the idea that, what would it be like if comics thought sort of outside the individual and started thinking about the community, that started thinking about us collectively, because that's where comics, I think it's underexplored territory in comics. And I think it's sort of the great challenge of our time to think outside of ourselves and to think in terms of the whole. This is the only way that we're going to sort of make it through. So why doesn't comics sort of play a role in that too? If that makes sense.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. And I sort of think that might be a good place to stop.
Okay.
Thank you so much for taking the time to talk to me.
Thank you much. I enjoyed it.
Bye-bye.
And now some words from anarchist prisoner Sean Swain.
Kevin J. Baxter has been the Erie County, Ohio prosecutor since the late 1980s. He prosecuted my 1991 trial and my 1995 retrial. As a Democrat, he was beholden to the local Democratic Party chair, Colette Crouch. It's just a terrible misfortune for me that Colette Crouch was also the aunt of the guy who broke into my home, the guy I killed in self-defense. Colette Crouch and her family wanted their pound of flesh, and it appears that Kevin J. Baxter was more than eager to help them get it. A number of incredibly peculiar things happened in order to turn my self-defense killing of another man into a murder. First, the break-in was covered up. Police testified that there were no photos of the door or the door frame. Those photos wouldn't surface until years later. Second, Crouch's criminal records disappeared at several different police stations, something that had to have been centrally orchestrated. Third, Baxter solicited testimony of Coroner Elizabeth Belraj from several counties away rather than the Erie County coroner. Belraj was famously pro-cop and testified that I stabbed Crouch from behind, testimony she recanted when later caught in her own lies. The star of Baxter's case, however, was a 12-year-old girl named Amy Peters, who claimed to see around buildings and through closed curtains and blinds, to see events that could not possibly have happened. Amy testified that she was coached the night before her testimony by Kevin Baxter himself, so that she would say everything she was supposed to say. After I was convicted in my retrial of a crime I provably didn't commit, Baxter turned to his assistant and said, loud enough for me to hear him, "It takes a good prosecutor to convict a guilty man. It takes a great prosecutor to convict an innocent one. I got this guy twice. What's that make me?" He pulled out all the stops to get Colette Crouch and her family the pound of flesh they wanted. From the beginning of his career, there were rumors of Baxter being dirty, stories of underage girls and drugs and alcohol on boat parties out on Lake Erie, and rumors of his involvement in the local drug trade. One local dealer named Mike Orshowski owned a Porsche in a 2-story home without a job and without paying taxes. He was never locally investigated. After a rumored falling out with Baxter, Orshowski died in a car wreck under mysterious circumstances. One prisoner in the Erie County Jail claimed to know that Baxter had put a hit out on Orshowski and that the killer had actually used a bowling ball to cause Orshowski to crash. Others would point to the investigation into a Huron business called Cabinet Choice. Cabinet Choice was allegedly investigated by prosecutor Marianne Barilski and a secret grand jury. Witnesses described a dark-haired guy in a blue pickup delivering cocaine to the business. Barilski sought the identity of that dealer until one witness dropped his name, Sean Baxter. Sean, the brother of prosecutor Kevin J. Baxter. Then suddenly, the investigation allegedly ended, and reportedly Kevin Baxter had his brother Sean relocated to Colorado. Krista Harris came forward to describe how Baxter abused his power to force her into a coercive sexually exploitive relationship. Harris had been the girlfriend of a murder defendant, and officials sought to incriminate Harris in that crime, until Baxter made a deal with Harris that reduced Harris to his sex slave, according to Harris's own sworn statement. When Harris came forward to accuse Baxter of rape and coercion, Baxter went after Harris to silence her, and even got her attorney, Elsbeth Baumgartner, disbarred. That's the ruthless reach that Baxter has. But it also appears this exploitation was not just a one-off. It appears he did the same to Diane Shio, now Diane Heights, in my criminal case. Threatening to charge Diane with crimes, police and prosecutors demanded that Diane make herself useful, and so she did, collecting a number of witnesses and changing her own story in my case. Rumors abound that Baxter used her as more than a witness. On the year anniversary of my false conviction, Diane attempted to burn her mom's home to the ground. She reportedly heard voices of demons and was found in the burning bedroom stabbing herself in the leg with a steak knife. The pressure and demands put on her by the prosecution appear to have driven her mad. She was indicted on 2 first-degree aggravated felonies by prosecutor Marianne Barilski. But during the pendency of the case, while Diane was out on bond for over a year, all notifications went to Baxter rather than Barilski. No idea what Baxter was demanding of Diane during that time, but in an unheard-of resolution to that case, Diane was found not guilty by reason of insanity, though competent, without ever going to trial. And that means that after 18 months or more, Baxter let Diane go without so much as a conviction. Sounds similar to the case of Krista Harris? If so, you have to wonder how much has been buried, if Baxter is perhaps the Harvey Weinstein of county prosecutors. Kevin Baxter's brother EJ came forward to confirm Kevin is both a drug kingpin and a sexual predator, and Kevin prosecuted his brother for it. EJ was given probation and sent back to Florida, forced into silence. That's the kind of guy Kevin J. Baxter is. A Facebook friend of his, Sue Dumas, reports that everyone knows Baxter is involved in criminality and drugs, but everyone is afraid to come forward. Baxter's just too powerful. But now, there's a website dedicated to exposing Kevin J. Baxter at www.the-exposer.com. Someone is doing a massive information dump on the prosecutor who falsely convicted and reconvicted me, implicating him in drugs, rape, and a lot more. Check it out. I recall what Baxter said. It takes a good prosecutor to convict a guilty man. It takes a great prosecutor to convict an innocent one. I got this guy twice. What's that make me? Well, it makes you a monster, Kevin. And now the whole world knows it. The whole world knows it. This is Anarchist Prisoner Sean Swain from the Super Duper Uber Mega Ultra Hyper Turbo Multi Maxi Max in Youngstown, Ohio. If you're checking out the-exposer.com, you are the resistance.
You can still write Sean at his new old new again address at Sean Swain, number A243205, OSP Youngstown, 878 Coatesville Hubbard Road, Youngstown, Ohio 44505. You can find his past writings, updates on his case, hear his past audio, find out how to get his books, plus ways to contribute to his legal defense fund at SeanSwain.org. The Final Straw is a proud member of the Channel Zero network of anarchist podcasts, and here's a jingle from another member of CCN.
I'm going to make those pompous academics regret kicking out such a genius. Deciding to build my lab and do my research.
The Time Talks Podcast.
Have you ever stared at a 500-page book and wish you could just talk to the author about their ideas instead? If so, the Time Talks Podcast, part of the Channel Zero network, is for you, where we discuss history, politics, music, and art with an anti-authoritarian and anarchist perspective.
The Time Talks Podcast.
What's this light? I feel different.
The Time Talks Podcast.
This is The Final Straw Radio. The show will later be archived at thefinalstrawradio.noblogs.org, and you can email us with questions and suggestions at thefinalstrawradio@riseup.net or thefinalstrawradio@protonmail.com. If you'd like to use any episode for your project or radio show, feel free to do so. Just send us an email to let us know. If you care to, you can send us letters at TFSR, P.O. Box 6004, Asheville, North Carolina, 28816.